Hello and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm Dr. Lee Kaplan. Today we're joined again by Dr. Sarah Balakrishnan to discuss her article Prison of the Womb: Gender, Incarceration, and Capitalism on the Gold Coast of West Africa 1500 to 1957. The conversation explores a largely erased history of indigenous prison systems in the Gold Coast and the central role women's bodies play in the development of debt, trade, and colonial economies from the 15th century to the 20th. Drawing from archival discoveries, oral testimonies, and overlooked colonial records, Balakrishnan traces how women were held as collateral in systems of credit, hostage-taking, and imprisonment long before and during European colonial rule. The discussion examines the emergence of debtors' prisons in West Africa, the gendered logic of incarceration, the relationship between kinship and finance, and the ways colonial administration simultaneously condemned and depended upon these prison systems for economic stability. Along the way, we discuss mercantile capitalism, palm oil economies after abolition, Victorian colonial morality, matrilineal social structures, public women and prostitution, and hostage-taking, all at the intersections of violence and sexuality, reproduction and governance. The conversation also reflects on the ethical and emotional weight of archival work, particularly the testimonies of incarcerated women whose voices survived in scattered colonial documents despite deliberate attempts to erase these from official systems of history. If you like what we do here, please subscribe at patreon.com/everythingisideology or offer a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Hello and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm incredibly excited to be joined again by the one and only Sarah Balakrishnan, and she is a Canadian Indian writer and scholar based in the Department of History at Duke University. Balakrishnan is the 2022 Narrative Prize winner, the winner of Narrative Magazine's Best Under 30 Writing Contest, and a finalist for the Cecilia Joyce Johnson Award for Short Fiction from the Key West Literary Seminar. Since 2020, Balakrishnan has served as fiction editor at the Maple Tree Literary Supplement. Her fiction writing has been supported by grants from Gradigan Hook, Hedgebrook, and the American Short Fiction. Balakrishnan received a PhD in history from Harvard University in 2020 and a BA in history and political theory from McGill University in 2014. She was a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge, a postdoctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia, and a postdoctoral fellow in the history department at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Balakrishnan's scholarly research has appeared in a number of prestigious venues, including the Journal of African History, the Journal of Social History, and Comparative Studies in Society and History. So I'm really excited to have you back to talk about some of your other pieces. I noticed, obviously, every scholar has like some sort of overlapping ways of sort of doing stuff, or obviously the themes, or kind of like the overall field in what you study. I found that you do a really wonderful job, as always, is sort of like connecting these various stories that are hard to find kind of in archival settings, and then bringing it into like this larger sort of thematic picture or story of something. And it's about something that I think not too many folks would sort of expect to think about, but prisons within the West African context and their emergence as both like in the colonial moment and after the colonial moment, or during the colonial moment. And I know probably not too many people sort of, when we hear the word sort of indigenous, a lot of times this is a very romantic word that's sort of an empty signifier for like a lost and fallen period that we're trying to get back in some sort of vaguish way. But you normally don't hear something like indigenous prison, right? So a lot of times, or at least in the reading I've kind of come across, like this term is not discussed nearly enough. And it's sort of like, okay, well, there were forms of kind of punishment in different ways happening that you talk about happening before the European moment, and then congealing with the sort of Dutch and Portuguese coming in that moment. So this is a very, very long and like a long array of history kind of stuff going on, because in the title of your piece, Prison of the Womb, which is a term you kind of coined and we'll talk about, but the history in which you focus on is from 1500s to 1957. So this is obviously covering a lot of ground, and like all sort of good historians, I see you're doing like the procedural thing and looking at things in particular moments and how one thing comes to another thing. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind discussing sort of the opening story of the article, and how it kind of connects to the just broader themes in what you want to bring out and discuss.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and just to sort of preface my remarks, um, you know, I sort of uncovered information about these prisons while I was, like a PhD, all good PhD history students. I was in the archives. I was collecting research for my doctoral project, which was about land. And as part of my kind of methodology of going through the archives, I really preference these folders called the Secretary of Native Affairs folders that we've discussed earlier that are really kind of location based, town by town, village by village, miscellaneous documents about local life. And so, because those were kind of my data set, they were the things that I was opening up every day and investigating. One of the things that I just noticed really early on was that there were so many petitions and letters about women who were inside what the colonial administration called the native prisons. The native prisons, which were prison system run by rulers that they called chiefs, and sometimes private individuals. And it just seemed to me as I was reading these letters, I was like, wow, like there's just a lot of women in these prisons. And that, really defies in some ways our kind of Western expectation that a prison complex would be centered around the imprisonment of men as it is in the United States and across the Western world. By the 19th century, the time period I was studying, I mean, women would have been less than 1% of prisoners inside Western prisons. And yet, what I was seeing in the Gold Coast context, in the context of modern day Ghana, was this repeated letters from family members, from concerned husbands, sometimes from children, worried about their wives and mothers and their sisters who were inside prison. And the story starts with this woman named Adjoa Nyame, um, who was being held in the prison run by the king of Gumoa, which is a kingdom in central sort of southern Ghana. And the family of Adjoa Nyame sent a letter to the chief saying that you have, impregnated this woman who is inside your prison. Now she's with child. We deserve compensation because this has happened. And this was something I kept seeing. And so even at the time when I was a PhD student, I thought, wow, like this is shocking. This is interesting. Maybe one day I'll write an essay about women in prison in colonial Ghana and really try to think about imprisonment from a gendered perspective because there was such a high percentage of women. And then, kind of in my spare time when I would come home from the archives and do a little research online to see what people had written about this topic, I realized that there wasn't a single article even about these prisons, and that scholars themselves didn't know anything about this prison system. And partly that was a peculiar and deliberate design function of the colonial state. The colonial state allowed these prisons to exist. They had developed kind of autonomously by African rulers and merchants before colonial rule, but the colonial state, understanding exactly how economically efficient these prisons were because they primarily functioned as debtors' prisons and held people, especially women, as collateral for debt. The colonial state, very uncomfortable about the politics behind that practice, especially since debtors' prisons had been abolished in Europe at that time, they deliberately kept these prisons off the record. And so partly scholars had no idea these prisons existed because the colonial state had done everything they could to keep them off the record. And it was really only by reading the kind of files that I was reading on a village by village basis, a town by town basis, that you would even know these prisons existed, let alone mainly incarcerated women. So it was a story that just really leapt out at me from the archive and that I ended up sort of pursuing very doggedly because once I realized that people didn't even know these prisons existed, it raised a whole host of new questions like why did they emerge? What were their politics? What was the economics behind incarceration in West Africa?
That's great. Thank you so much. It covers so many different questions all in sort of one Brilliant answer. So I was kind of curious then also, the title of your piece, what's your central or main sort of interventions? You already listed a number of different interventions happening within this sort of historiographical literature on women's prison. And there's also the aspect of sort of bringing in non-European kind of prison systems and stuff like this going on, right? Which also takes into account, which also sort of talks back to various sort of Foucauldian notions of the prison system and discipline and punishment and stuff like this. So we have that going on. Um, would you mind kind of talking a little bit about what the specific sort of like intervention is in terms of what is this prison of the womb you speak of?
Yeah, the term prison of the womb is meant to capture several kind of unfolding dynamics. The first is that one of the most basic interventions I was attempting to make was to say, look, most of the prison systems that we understand as having emerged around the world, incarcerated male people, people who are gendered male. But in incarcerating people who are gendered male, we're usually attempting to capture what people talk about as a male productive labor force. That states around the world, whether were Western metropolitan states or the colonial states that Western metropolitan places sort of inspired, what they were doing was capturing male labor that was being channeled either towards state labor or towards private capital. So whether we think about colonial Jamaica or we think about the United States, men were being held in prison, usually after the abolition of slavery, in order for some power, the state or private capital, to continue to exploit their labor, to remove their labor from the free market, to be able to direct male productive labor towards all kinds of ends, whether that was on plantations or building state infrastructure. And what I was looking at was a prison system in West Africa that was holding female labor hostage. And that wasn't female productive labor in the sense that women are like factory workers producing cloth or textiles or something. It was actually holding their reproductive labor hostage. The fact that women were so valued economically in West Africa because they are reproducers of labor. For those who are sort of more familiar with West African contexts, they understand that Africa has a very low population density for the amount of land it encompasses. Africa is a gigantic continent, and for most of its history, it was fairly underpopulated because of environmental disease. Disease like yellow fever and malaria consistently killed children in very high rates. Infant mortality was very high in Africa before recent years. And women could expect to have many, many children in their lifetimes who would die before the age of 7. And so in a context of low population density, labor is tremendously valued, and women are valued above men for their capacity, their gendered capacity to reproduce. And so in many ways, women themselves constituted assets to households. They constituted assets to their husbands, who often had to save up an enormous amount of money to pay bride wealth. And so when a carceral system emerged around the problem of debt, that this was primarily a debtor's prison. If one is going to seize anyone's assets, seize any collateral on a loan, in the West African context, that collateral was not land like it would emerge in Europe. It was not other movable property. It was women, and so a carceral system emerged in West Africa in the early 19th century to mainly hold women or to hold reproduction itself hostage. And that's really my intention around the term prison of the womb, is not only to make the point that this is a carceral system shaped around holding women's bodies hostage, but in particular about seizing reproductive labor and holding sexual reproduction itself hostage, unlike the genealogy that we're all more familiar with, which is capturing male productive labor.
Yeah, no, thank you. Along with that, you kind of also lay out the other reasons why this was so incredibly effective in getting collectors and debtors to sort of, work as fast as possible, because there's this thing happening with familial relations, matrilineal relations, bloodline, and menstruation as well. Alongside that is also what you lay out as the spatial sort of conceptions of it, which is where it's near and who it's near to, and therefore some kings and other sort of figures have more access to these bodies. Now, before moving on, would you mind saying something a little bit about that? Because I found this to be crucial.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm really trying to think about, especially in my other work, the work I'm writing right now, is to think about exactly what kinds of collateral end up spurring different kinds of behaviors amongst kin groups. One of the things that I argue in this essay, Prison of the Womb, is that women, yes, women are assets to their households because they represent reproduction for sure. But what happens when a woman is seized as collateral for a man's loan is that her seizure ends up kind of catalyzing her entire kin network who will work to affect her release. So usually what happens is, say a merchant is paid in advance on trade. He's maybe a long distance trader. He's used to going into the interior, maybe getting gold, getting palm oils, cocoa eventually, and bringing that to the coast to be sold. So he gets an advance from merchants on those goods. And when he doesn't repay the deal on time, a warrant can be summoned for the arrest of someone from his household, and it will end up being probably his wife or his sister. These guards will show up at the house. They will seize the woman. She will be formally incarcerated inside a prison that in Akan would be called the FIAC. Um, and and what that will mean is, of course, the man is now suddenly like his interest in repaying this debt is obviously rejuvenated by the capture of his wife. But it's not just him who is affected when a woman is seized. I mean, she's his wife, but she's someone else's mother. She's someone else's sister. She's someone else's niece. And so an entire kin group is essentially radicalized towards her emancipation. What this means is that the seizure of women as collateral effectively makes her entire kin group co-signers on the loan. Suddenly, everybody's interest is at stake. Everybody's asset has been seized. And all these people who otherwise might not have had any economic incentive to help this man repay a debt are now effectively amassing the capital in order to be able to effect the emancipation of their female relative. And so, in this way, one of the things I was arguing is that, I mean, we know that African kinship is an important social structure inside West African societies, but we have to think about them as the economic backbone of everyday finance, credit, and trade relationships in Africa. And there is no better example of exactly how kinship groups end up becoming the financial through which debt is regulated than the seizure of women who literally sit at the center of African kinship groups. Because, at least among the Akan in Ghana, they are matrilineal. Bloodlines pass through the woman, they pass through her blood. I mean, it's considered that a child who is born among the Akan, they have the blood of their mother, because when when menstruation is suspended during pregnancy, people think that blood is being transferred to the fetus who is growing inside her womb. And the father transmits the personality. It's called the sunsum. That's through semen. The personality of the child comes from the father, but the blood comes from the mother. So bloodlines pass through the woman. The woman sits at the center of the concept of kinship. And so when a woman is seized, it is spurring the entire kin group to respond to the collective call to repay this loan. And that is something we can see from the beginning of Atlantic trade in the 15th century all the way into the 19th century with the growth of what will be called mercantile capitalism.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think you lay it out quite nicely. The other aspect that's quite heart-wrenching about this, I mean, the whole thing is really like obviously gripping, but another aspect that's quite sort of heart-wrenching is that there seems to be a timeline or sort of a ticking time bomb happening in these situations where if you don't get this person by a certain time, there's a likelihood that she'll have a connection, a very forced connection, right? Which we with something like the king or the king's brother or something like this, and therefore alienate herself from the society in which she was born into and force her to be this concubine convict, right? So you discussed this blurred line between concubine and convict, and I think it fits really, I mean, it fits really nicely within the discussion of sort of this ambivalent sort of in between place where women can be, because they're the most powerful, they could be the most vulnerable or something like this. And, I think that's maybe something, I'd like to hear a little bit about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this was really one of the more radical parts of the argument surrounding the prison of the womb was that, like in every carceral context that we know about, whether that's in the West or in Africa, I mean, sexual assault, rape was very, very common. It we know these are common phenomena among populations who are held captive and who, as Giorgio Agamben would say, are imprisoned as bare life. They're subject to sovereign power, but without rights and protections. But the thing that I argue that I think is a little bit more radical than how we think about carceral rape in the Western context is that this isn't just something that everybody knows is going on, but is actually a part of the structural process that incentivizes kin to repay loans as quickly as possible. I mean, it's not just that, oh no, like your sister has been seized for her husband's loan, like we care about her, so we have to get her out. It's we care about her and we know that in this facility she might be subjected to sexual assault and she might be subject to rape. And if that rape results in a pregnancy, it's very likely that her first marriage will end and she will be incorporated as a junior wife or as a concubine in this man's house. And so there is a very real risk that is placed on what we would consider the family asset. I mean, in a purely financial way, I mean, people would say we're worried the asset is going to be liquidated, that it's going to be sold to someone else, and that's essentially what carceral assault or carceral rape signifies in this context. And so, really, I felt radical at the time to argue it, but I was convinced that, I mean, sexual assault was not just an incident that happened inside prisons, as it does everywhere in the world, but it was part of the structural duress that was incentivizing the very quick financial assembly of capital that families were hurrying towards in order to emancipate their female relatives. It was not just care for the woman on an emotional or social level, but a real worry about their physical integrity because they knew that sexual assault happens inside these carceral spaces. And so that was part of the prison of the womb, was to say that reproduction itself was at risk because carceral impregnation happened, like in the case of Adjuanyame, which is how the paper opens with this woman who was married and who is incarcerated for only a short period of time, and by the time she's released, she is pregnant with the sovereign's child. And the family just then undergoes the kind of typical ritual that would then occur in this instance, where they are given money and compensation, but she is transferred as if as an asset to this man's house to now become a junior wife, which is a status that verges very closely on concubinage or some sort of servile relationship, a total removal of her kinship networks that had previously secured or helped secure her release. Um, and so this to me is the sexual economics behind how loans and finance is regulated in West Africa during a very long period, from the 15th century to the end of the 19th, early 20th century. I mean, almost 500 years through which sexual relations really are the backbone behind credit relationships over a vast geography.
Yeah, no, it's definitely quite shocking to think about the ways imperialism was and the credit system was sort of built by like this sort of Damocles sword of kind of like male patriarchal violence against the female body. Um, but this also sort of reminds me a little bit about the role of public women that you discuss too, in particular, and because it's such a specific sort of social position and social role. So would you mind talking about the why there's the public woman is sort of like a thing within the social structure, and also the role of her and sort of the vulnerability of that position, and how sort of the Dutch and other colonizing figures and entities exploited that. So I sort of mean to discuss kind of like the ways in which polygamous marriage gives a and polygamous marriage and sort of like not kind of having the money or assets to pay for the marriage results in sort of a bunch of like a surplus population that has all of this sexual energy, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. I mean, yes, and this is a great question. And one of the things the essay attempts to do is sort of say, even though these prisons emerge in southern Ghana in the kind of early to mid 19th century, like 1850s time period, even though these prisons only emerged in the middle of the 19th century, we cannot understand an institution of gendered captivity like this without tracing the earlier history through which women were prized as assets, through which the captivity of women were the backbone, sort of financing Atlantic trade. And so that's where the essay begins. like from the late 15th century onward, from the beginning of the Portuguese traders arriving, closely followed by the Spanish and the Dutch and the British, etc. Women as assets and women's imprisonment facilitates Atlantic trade by providing the collateral on everyday loans. And so the example that I use really for thinking about this process is, as you referred to, the public women, or what in Akan were called the etiguafo. And etiguafo are essentially prostitutes, but they're public town prostitutes, and there are a lot of social rituals and laws that surround their captivity. So because in West African societies, like most African societies, were polygamous. And they were polygamous in a patriarchal sense. So men were allowed to acquire many wives, but a wife could only have one husband. And in order to kind of conduct a marriage in West Africa, because women were these kind of prized assets and kinship structures, men paid, what we would call a dowry or bride wealth. In other words, they would go to a family and say, I want to marry, your daughter. Here is a payment. Sometimes it was gold, cattle, cloth. I mean, there were a lot of different kinds of currencies that would be involved, and a family would kind of cater to their different choices, and suitors would agree on a suitor. And so men, to pay bride wealth, which was called a seda in Akan. I mean, men, in order to pay a seda, would have to accumulate a certain amount of capital to be able to make that kind of offer. And for various reasons, that took a long time. I mean, West African societies are what Claude Meillassoux would traditionally call gerontocracies, meaning that they were ruled by elders. Elders were a class. They captured and exploited the labor of the youth, and it took men an incredibly long time to accumulate the capital for a seda, especially if they came from a commoner background. So while you had women marrying in their teens, 15, 16, 17, men often had to wait until their 30s to be able to accumulate the capital to have a wife and begin their own household. And so, I mean, it's unrealistic to expect that men would wait until their 30s to have sex. And elders were pretty shrewd about that. Men are not going to be celibate for decades of their life. And so that's where the role of the public woman, or the etiguafo, comes in, is that towns would purchase enslaved women who acted as the public prostitutes for the community. Usually towns, it seems, had 2 to 3, sometimes 4 public women. These were it kind of defies our sort of Western expectation around the status of a prostitute, because I think people think of this as a very low class or working class or certainly blue collar position. But in West Africa, even though these women were enslaved, I mean, there was a real elevation of social status surrounding them. I mean, all of the sources that we have, and there are many, many European sources that talk about the etiguafo, because European travelers themselves are sort of entranced by this position, but all of them will describe these women as extremely beautiful, extremely well dressed, dressed in the finest cloths, wearing beautiful gold jewelry, gold earrings. I mean, they own their own houses on the outskirts of town, and they are really thought of not just as call girls, but as the wives of the young men. And that's how they're described, the wives of the young men, that these relationships that would develop between young men and etiguafo were not just physical, but they were romantic. I mean, they were deeply emotional. I mean, the men are described as being addicted and in love with the town prostitutes. The town prostitutes are kind of these communal wives of young male bachelors. And so what Europeans decided to do pretty early on was, if they had a credit dispute with the young man, or some young man had violated some terms of treaties. I mean, in order to get people to pay up, they would kidnap the town prostitutes. And Willem Bosman, who's a Dutch merchant, in 1704, he writes this book that's like the primary source that every historian of West Africa uses, because it's gigantic and very detailed. And he was considered to be ethnographically quite sensitive to the complexities of African society. And he just laughs about it. He's like, nothing will afflict these poor creatures more than seizing their town whores. If you want to make young men pay their loans, you seize the town whores. And according to him, the young men would appeal to the male merchants, the elders, who would usually give over the capital for these young men to secure the women's release. And so, to me, it was impossible to think about a gendered nature of a prison system that held women collateral, in the 19th century without recognizing the kind of long prehistory of this story that really crystallizes in the figure of the town prostitute, who is considered the community's most valuable asset and therefore the one that is at the greatest risk of seizure by hungry creditors.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you trace this idea of the sort of female hostage to the female incarcerated prisoner in those terms. So it's a very, I thought, historically pithy way of cataloging this process of one thing transforming into another in this really complicated way. And one way I wanted to kind of just ground this discussion is just because you go over so much vast history and there's moved so many moving parts and stuff like this, is to just talk about the way you divided the article. So you wrote this article is divided into three parts. The first provides context on gender relations and female hostages in West Africa before the 19th century, shaped by the Atlantic slave trade, which we kind of have touched on and talked about. And the second part studies the role of West African prison in the spread of mercantile capitalism on the Gold Coast in the 19th century as ransom technology. And the third part goes into the oral testimonies that you found. Um, would you, so we, if you feel like we should start with the first section, if we didn't, well, would you mind?
Sure. Well, when thinking about the kind of first section on like the gendered history of captivity and how this becomes the financial backbone of slave trading or the Atlantic trade anyway, I mean, there were two real institutions that I tried to draw out in my research in talking about the prehistory of the gendered prison. The first is this institution called pawning. And pawning or pawns, of course, many of us have heard the term pawns. One thinks about pawn shop, and that concept is pretty true when we talk about Atlantic trade. Essentially, what European merchants would do is they would provide advances to African merchants in exchange for the promises that those African merchants would return with the goods that Europeans desired. So at first, up until about 1680, that's gold. After about 1680, the primary export out of the Gold Coast becomes enslaved people. And in exchange for advances given to African merchants who are supposed to return with these trade items, Africans would give over pawns. And this means an asset of theirs that's basically a promissory note, a promise that they are going to come back and make good on this trade. And of course, naturally, the pawn is kind of a fraction of the value of the advance given to that trader. And at first, sort of before 1680, the historian Judith Spixley argues that the primary pawn is gold, which is true. I mean, Africans will give over kind of these ritualized gold amulets or gold necklaces that have a lot of religious value as their pawn, sort of saying, obviously, I'm going to come back for this. You can trust me. But after 1680, the primary form of collateral is women and children, dependents of the man's household, the male merchant's household. And this to me was very important as a precursor to the prison. That from the kind of inception of Atlantic trade, we have women and children really being forfeited as assets willingly to co-sign these loans as collateral for loans. So that was the first institution I trace out in that section. The second thing that I talk about is a practice called penyaring. And this is a uniquely West African sort of practice. And the historian Paul Lovejoy argues that the term panyar comes from a combination of the Portuguese word pinora for pawning and apanhar to grab. So like a pawn that you grab, which is in fact exactly what penyaring was. Penyaring basically means forcibly seizing an asset from a debtor to be held as collateral to make them repay the loan. And you can, I mean, in the Atlantic context, Europeans penyar all sorts of things. They'll penyar canoes, they'll penyar guns, they'll penyar goods, but most commonly they penyar people. And what this means is they seize a person who is usually not the person who is responsible for the defaulting loan themselves. Sometimes it's as loosely based as that person is from their town. Like someone in Cape Coast owes me money. I have panyard a Cape Coast person on the debtor's head. That's the language they'll use. On the debtor's head, like it's the debtor's fault. I have panyard this person, and I'm going to hold them as collateral until a loan is paid. And traditionally, historians who have studied penyaring have not really thought about the gendered aspect of it. And partly that's because of this rhetoric around the seizure being arbitrary, that's defined by geography, like someone from that person's town. I think there's an implicit assumption that people who conduct long distance trade and who are at most at risk for being panyard are men. But in my work, I mean, I really argue that evidence from the Gold Coast suggests the opposite, that it's primarily women who are being panyard. And rather than think of panyaring as the arbitrary seizure of someone on someone else's head, I mean, if you're going to hold someone hostage to make someone repay a loan, it makes sense that the person isn't arbitrary. You want to seize a socially valuable person as a hostage. Hostages are only worth something if they are socially valuable. And because women sit at the center of kinship networks, they are the most valuable assets. And so I argue that the people who were most commonly panyard during the Atlantic period were women, and they're women being seized usually from the household or from the town of the debtor to kind of incentivize that kin group to once again quickly assemble the capital in order to secure her release. And at least in the Atlantic slave trade period, the ultimate duress, kind of threatened by panyaring, is not just a woman's sexual assault, which we feel I'm pretty confident that happened during that period too, just as it will later. But that if a hostage is not redeemed on time, they're sold into slavery. And so there is this sense, once again, of the ticking time clock that's going off the moment someone is seized as a captive or panyard. That if their family will not gather the capital in time, they will be sold into slavery. And so those are in the first section, the two institutions I trace is in order to understand the emergence of a female gendered prison in West Africa, we first have to understand that women were consensually held as collateral through the institution of pawning. And we also have to understand that they were non-consensually seized as collateral through the practice of penyaring. And both of these sort of come to crystallize in the construction of the women gendered prison in West Africa.
Yeah, no, that's great. There was a brief sort of mention of kind of Victorian sensibilities and morality when it came to having women in the prison. And it kind of like shocked, in a way, it seemed like the consciousness of the people holding the women in prison. So it's kind of strange, as always is the case with sort of like European consciousness and where it's sort of like, okay, they're fine with, slavery, they're fine with certain things, but then there's a woman in prison and that's where they draw the line, but at the same time, they knew the woman was being raped by the king, and so I just didn't quite understand, the sense of sort of the Victorian sensibilities within this, so I thought that was really interesting, and it reminded me of this other part of the article where you talk about something like colonial repugnancy, and that's like yeah, so, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about those 2 things coming together.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was trying to describe in this essay is just, you know, the cra- one of the craziest things about the indigenous prison system that, comes to concentrate on the imprisonment of the woman's body as in order to affect debt repayments is the fact that the colonial state let it go on. Not only that they let it go on when, as I'll talk about, they have a lot of problems with it, but it's just really amazing that a sovereign power is okay with the continuation of a carceral system that is actually outside their power, that's being adjudicated by African courts, that is being marshaled by African soldiers and by African sovereigns, and the colonial state really has no hand at all. And one of the things that I come to kind of advocate for or argue in this case is that, European governors, successive European governors will enter the Gold Coast and discover this prison system exists and will be horrified. They're like, there are these dungeons. I mean, and to be fair, even though the term dungeon, they mean it pejoratively, they really are dungeons. I mean, these are not modern penitentiaries by any means. They are usually basement rooms inside the sovereign's house. The sovereign's house is called the Efiase, or is called the Ahenfie. And that's a combination of the term Ohene, meaning ruler, and Efie, house. So the Ahenfie is the ruler's house. And the term for prison is Efiase, and that means Efie, house, and Asie, underground. So underground house. It's literally these underground rooms inside the ruler's house, dungeons. In which women are held and women are assaulted and women are sometimes kept naked and chained and they don't have any light and there's no lavatories, just like just like with the dungeons of the slave trade. And I mean, every governor comes in is like, this is horrifying. Why has no one banned this? This is crazy. We have to abolish this. I mean, William Branford Griffith, the governor in the 1880s, I mean, he was the leader of this. He was like, this is crazy. We can't do this. And then every governor finds out that this institution is integral to economic function, that all the merchants use the debtors' prisons, that this is the most efficient way of making debtors repay their loans, and that these prisons are the backbone of financial circulation in the colony. And they all kind of throw up their hands and say, well, then I don't want to know anything about it. And this is the story behind these prisons being kept consistently off the record during colonial rule, is that they are so integral to the functioning of the economy. But because they seem so scandalous to the Victorian imagination, the Europeans want to have as little to do with it as possible. They don't like that it's women who are incarcerated instead of men. They don't like that these women are kept naked and chained, nor should they. They don't like that the women are frequently assaulted. They don't like that these are these underground, horrible little dungeons. It just none of it seems modern. None of it seems clean. None of it seems like it should be an artifact of a modern state. But yet these institutions are just so effective at making kin groups repay credit lines. And so they are kept off the record. And they're kept off the record the entire way through colonial rule. I mean, it's actually amazing. I mean, I found these documents from the late 1940s. They're the first documents the colonial state ever releases saying, look, if a woman is about to give birth, you have to release her from prison. It's like their first regulations around acknowledging that these are women who are in prison, because it scandalizes them, but they maintain the institution precisely because the institution is so effective at doing what it's doing, which is regulating the economy.
Of course. Why would they touch it if it was doing what they wanted it to do or something like this? Um, I was thinking there also seems to be certain slippages that kind of happen between the two institutions, where sometimes a debtor might go to a West African kind of penal system, and then sometimes they might go to the colonial sort of system. But either way, it doesn't turn out to be too great for the ones that are held hostage or captive. Can you discuss some of the slippages that happen between those two court systems? There seems to be this is like a very weird case of dual structures and dual power existing within the colonial system. But of course, it's on like the sort of subjugation of kind of different peoples of the African populace. So it's kind of exploitative, but it's dual power. It's very confusing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big fallacies in thinking about concepts like indirect rule, especially as applies to a place like Ghana, is we think, oh, yeah, like, sure, chiefs have courts, but the courts are under the state. I mean, this scholars have often said, the chiefs are the handmaidens of colonial government. They are like delegated all these powers. And so they rule on a local level. Mahmoud Mamdani, the political scientist, calls chiefs the tools of decentralized despotism, that they are given all these powers by the state to deliberately kind of administer colonialism on a local level. But in Ghana, and we can see this very significantly in the example of the prison system. I mean, these powers and these institutions develop before colonial rule, before the British state will declare a colony in 1873 in the Gold Coast. More than 2 decades earlier, these prisons have emerged as really an integral institution in the functioning of the economy. And so the colonial state, again, recognizing its efficiency, decide not to ban it. But what this means is that you have two different court systems. You have indigenous sovereigns, the Ahene and the Manseme, who run their own courts that have prisons. And then you have the colonial state that have their own courts and their own prisons. And these are actually two different administrations of law. Of course, they will call the indigenous courts customary law, as if this is all about African ritual, custom, and sociality. In fact, as this comes to be practiced in the Gold Coast, because African sovereigns require a different standard of evidence when it comes to debts, most creditors who want to make their debtors repay their loans will seek out the African courts instead of the European courts. Why? Because European courts require a standard of evidence that usually involves the written word. So if a creditor says, well, this debtor owes me, this debtor, this debtor didn't give me collateral, et cetera, et cetera. The European courts want written documents to that effect. If people provide different testimony, the Europeans will have a difficult time deciding. And of course, European courts uphold the idea of the political individual as the contractual actor. If a political individual takes out a loan, the only person you can hold responsible for not paying that loan is the political individual. Political individualism is so central to the Western idea of justice. Whereas in the African idea of justice, I mean, kin groups are responsible for what their members do. You can, in fact, hold someone else responsible for another person's behavior. But also, they don't require the same written evidence basis for adjudicating debts. If it's enough for a creditor to say, this guy owes me, so I'm going to seize this from his family, and that's sufficient evidence. So creditors go to the indigenous courts primarily as a way of getting redress, and the indigenous courts will imprison women or female relatives on the heads of their husbands who have reneged on their loans. And that's the indigenous basis for the debt system, is that by holding kin groups responsible, the blame is actually delegated to women whose bodies can be held in prison until these crimes kind of undergo a system of redress and there's financial compensation paid for them. And so plaintiffs, they are at will to shop between these two different legal forums, and those legal forums can be more effective in some instances, in some cases, than others. And when it comes to criminal justice, everybody seeks redress through the European justice system. And in theory, the colonial courts have criminal jurisdiction, not the indigenous courts. And the indigenous courts, which are supposed to be really attending to kind of social, customary stuff like marriage or whatever, are really become the forum for credit relationships. And it's not even African creditors who are always using them. I mean, I have examples of Lebanese merchants, Syrian merchants who are all involved in the Gold Coast and who are, in fact, using the indigenous prison system. I think it's pretty clear that missionaries also used it. Pretty much anyone who wanted someone to repay their debts went to the African prison system instead of the European prison system, and used this system through which kin members could be held responsible for other people's loans.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating that both things existed at the same time and it wasn't just like a structural totality. And not only that, but as you say, they function so different epistemologically and socially as well. It's kind of radical to think about something like that happening here where you could sort of choose your punishment in some ways, or choose the court to delegate responsibility to. I think that would be a sort of interesting. I don't can't think of any other historical parallels. Maybe you can. I was thinking about, then we could turn to hear a little bit about the oral testimonies that you kind of found and heard about throughout this.
Yeah. Well, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, the thing that really stood out to me while I was doing my archival work was the voices of these women that I would come across in all sorts of different places. I mean, because these prisons were not ruled by the colonial state. I mean, there were no centralized files for them. I
Yeah.
mean, you could easily not know they existed if you came into the Accra archives. Government offices have their own files. If you were a person who said, I want to study prisons in colonial Ghana, you could come to the Accra archives and pull up all the files from the Department of Prisons, and they would only ever tell you about the one prison system, which was the colonial state prisons. So you could never know anything about them. You really had to be looking in all the wrong places in order to find evidence. And the thing that stuck out to me as I was doing, again, my work on land, not even seeking out anything on incarceration, were these letters written by women or testimonies involving women who were explaining in their own frank terms what had happened to them, that their brother had owed a debt or their husband had owed a debt, and they were incarcerated. And then someone had maybe a guard had propositioned them, or a guard had forced themselves onto them. And many of these women described how they were pregnant, and the salt had caused them to bleed. And um, a few years ago, when I first wrote a draft of this paper, I workshopped it at the Women's History Workshop at the University of Minnesota. And the thing that so many of the participants in this workshop said to me was that they just couldn't believe how frank the women were in these testimonies. And that was something that I felt too, was just there was a real rawness to their descriptions of what they had undergone, a real lack of sort of legal pretense. Um, and many of these testimonies had been sent to the colonial state in this attempt, um, this ultimately futile attempt to get the colonial government to do something about what was happening in these prisons. And these women were just so candid and so honest about what they had endured. And that was really important to me because I had no intention of ever writing about incarceration. I had no intention of writing about credit or how debt operated in Ghana. But it was these testimonies by these women explaining what they had endured that the fact that no one had ever written an essay about it, that we knew nothing about these prisons, that we did not know they incarcerated women. I mean, it was the thing that moved me towards writing this work was once I saw these letters and these testimonies and I kept seeing them, like I just knew that I couldn't turn away. And that these stories that these women had that many of these women had undertaken profound amounts of steps in order to create in the first place, that they had hired stenographers who knew how to write, that they'd hired translators who knew English, just to be able to get these letters into the hands of someone who had the power to do something or to transform this system, and that those transformations never ended up happening. It really was very important to me in pushing me to do this work that I otherwise had no intention of ever embarking on. Because these prisons held so many women over so many generations. The letters are everywhere. They're in every archive, in every random folder, because they're not centralized in any one place.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think once you sort of know something or read something, it's like kind of we're obligated to do something about it in the present. There's a lot of different sort of literature that I'm looking at that makes me feel that sort of way. Like, okay, well, this sort of happened, and now I'm in this position now. Like, what do we do as a result of this material stuff? So, for instance, like recently, Wissam Saeed just wrote basically throughout his family's experience throughout the Palestinian, most recent sort of iteration of the Palestinian genocide. He wrote about it, and a big piece of this was like, I didn't write this to make you feel bad. I wrote this so you witness it and you have the historical sort of burden to do something with it. And so there's a lot of literature that's looking at like this like implicated kind of subject and implicated reader as a
Mhm.
result of this. And it's sort of like, you know, the ancestors calling out, telling you to do something about it in a like an Olivia but in a Butlerian kind
Yeah.
of way. So I noticed that like obviously a central thing is sort of economics throughout this, and the role that women play in society and the sort of elision that happened as a result of this. But as we know, economics are constantly always changing,
Mhm.
um, and things are always moving, right? The anarchy of the market kind of thing. So during the abolition of slavery, economics start to change, and
Mhm.
then palm oil starts to play a really big role. I was wondering if you could talk about how the prison might have changed during this period of sort of abolition, palm oil, looking for other forms of revenue, things like this.
Yeah, great question. So, in a nutshell, the Gold Coast was named the Gold Coast because it had a huge reserve of gold that Europeans were after. I mean, gold kind of minted from the Gold Coast, was trafficked throughout the world in the 15th and 16th century, minted as currency, really facilitated Europe's trade with China and India. But by the 1680s, gold sort of ends up declining. Gold exports decline in the Gold Coast for various reasons. I mean, one thing is that a lot of the mines are exhausted. I mean, there are so many people who want to buy gold, but gold output is no larger. Is not increasing. Some mines become exhausted and close, and so by the 18th century, enslaved people become the number one export in the Gold Coast. And Rebecca Shumway has written very elegantly that there's pretty much no territory in Africa that has such an accelerated relationship with the slave trade. I mean, for the first 200 years in which Europeans are in the Gold Coast, not a single enslaved person is sold out of Ghana. I mean, they're selling gold, they're not selling enslaved people. Ghana is actually buying enslaved captives, they're a slave purchaser for a very long time. I mean, it's not like a they're not large slave purchaser. I mean, slave captives are about 10% of the imports being brought into the Gold Coast. But that's their relationship. They have almost no relationship with the slave export trade. And then in the 18th century, suddenly they become the world's largest producer of enslaved captives. It happens very, very quickly. About 1.2 million out of the 12 million people sold into bondage across the Atlantic came from the Gold Coast, and almost all of them came in the 18th century. It's as if, I mean, most other territories can have figures like that, but drawn out over 400 years. In Ghana, it is 100 years. It happens very, very quickly. Then abolition happens very, very quickly. In 1804, the Danish abolish the Atlantic slave trade, kind of ending the slave exports in eastern Ghana. The British follow suit in 1807. The Dutch in the West follow suit in 1813. So in less than 10 years, slave exports really stop in the Gold Coast. There's a little bit of illicit trafficking happening across the Volta River in the area that's now Togo, but essentially slave exporting really grinds to a halt. And this is the primary commodity being sold out of southern Ghana. I mean, it changes the fates of African merchants who have become very experienced in slave trading. It changes the fates of the trade networks that are kind of moving in the interior. And of course, it changes the nature of European commerce. There used to be more Europeans in Ghana than in any shoreline in Africa. And after the abolition happens, I mean, many of those merchants and companies just pack up and go home. Why are they here? So after abolition really begins this era that other historians have called the era of legitimate commerce. And legitimate commerce is a term invented in England to describe the distinction between commerce not produced by slaves and commerce produced by slaves. Commerce of slaves is illegitimate commerce, like it's immoral. And legitimate commerce is, this has nothing to do with slavery. And what they really mean is the production of cash crops or natural resources that are now becoming tied to the Industrial Revolution. England is undergoing its Industrial Revolution at this time, and how the Gold Coast becomes involved, amongst many things, is the production of palm oil. Palm oil from West Africa helps lubricate all of these industrial machines that are being used in the Industrial Revolution. Is also key to soap production, which is important. So palm oil, which had always been sort of sold and exported from the Gold Coast, begins a far more mass production in the early to mid-19th century, particularly in the eastern Gold Coast and around what's called the Krobo hinterlands. Plantation merchants really begin to cultivate palm oil plantations. This is the transition that a lot of people talk about, is the slave trade ends, legitimate commerce begins, and previously wealthy African merchants who had made their fortunes in slave trading reinvest that money into creating plantations. They reinvested in purchasing land, buying enslaved labor. Almost all of the palm oil is, in fact, being produced by unfree labor, which is the secret behind legitimate commerce. And this is what Emmanuel Champong calls the emergence of the first African capitalist class. That merchants who previously had made their money off the slave trade start to reinvest those profits in the plantations. As they develop more profits from the plantations, they reinvest those profits in expanding their plantations. And suddenly we get the first ever capitalist class in the Gold Coast, which is making its money off oil production that requires the development of real estate. And for various reasons, around the 1860s and 70s, that generation goes broke. It's actually a really important story to try to understand the process of colonization, that there used to be these really, really wealthy African people who had a tremendous amount of power and for various reasons go bankrupt around the exact time that Europeans will decide this is going to become a colony, and suddenly people don't really have the capital to fight them off. And there are various reasons why this generation goes broke. One of them is that even though they're producing a tremendous amount of oil, Africans don't have their own shipping lines or their own shipping companies, so they can't actually be the ones to export the oil to Europe. They're at the mercy of European shipping lines who decide to charge whatever they want. They charge crazy rates to these African merchants because they have no competition, and African merchants have to depend on these shipping lines. So that's one thing. The second is that Australian tallow sort of emerges around this time period and becomes a real competitor against palm oil. All these other oils basically start undercutting the palm oil market. And at the same time, as A.G. Hopkins has shown, there suddenly becomes a radical inflation in cowrie shells. Cowrie shells, which had previously been a very very important West African currency. You can read Toby Green's book, A Fistful of Shells, which is a history of the cowrie shell. It was one of the principal currencies inside West Africa, and Europeans trade in cowrie shells. But it's a limited currency to the extent that Europeans will not accept cowrie shells in kind as a currency. And because these are dug up from the Indian Ocean, Europeans who have a much more radical capacity to be able to extract cowrie shells than other places basically flood the West African market with cowrie shells, leading to the currency's inflation and therefore devaluing. And so African merchants who had previously stockpiled cash in cowrie shells suddenly find their fortune is not worth what they thought it was. And they're paying these crazy shipping lines, and their competition is being undercut by oil from Australia. And through this three-way combination of factors, this class that could have been a wealthy merchant class that could have maybe changed the fate of West Africa's economy, they become bankrupt. And I argue that is the kind of long historical context through which to understand the emergence of these debtors' prisons, that at the time that this mercantile class is going broke, that is exactly when these prisons develop. And I think it is because these large mercantilists are trying to squeeze petty traders for their cash. You see a lot of the people who end up in these prisons. There's actually a dispute where the merchant is like, "Hey, I said I was going to repay you in cowrie shells, and now you're telling me I have to repay in gold. Like, I don't have gold. You said it was cowrie shells." And the mercantilist is like, "No, I said you had to pay me in gold." I mean, and they're really having these currency disputes through the debtor's prison because there is this context of inflation that is driving this process. And so the debtor's prison is born during this era of increasing bankruptcy in West Africa, and this wealthy class is on its radical decline.
Of course, yeah, that has radical implications also for just the ways in which people use the prison system and think of the prison system and start strategizing in different ways. Um, it seems to be that the idea of sort of, the prison system was so well established as a social norm in various ways, like in female hostage, you talk about as a commonality or a common thing, that it actually worked its way into the language, specifically in the form of proverbs. So I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about the proverbs you found, and like how they help navigate this to sort of like a common sense understanding of what's going on.
Well, one of the things I love about Tree, which is the Kan language, is that like across West Africa, people love to speak in proverbs. They're intensely metaphorical. What that means is that the proverb is a really interesting window into understanding the logic of how things used to operate. Or they're a window into the past. That's what I like about words in Tree in general, like the word FESA for prison is underground house. Most words are compound words, so you can try to understand how people actually arrived at the concept. Um, Now, when it comes to proverbs, there was this kind of German missionary named Johann Gottlieb Christaller, who operated in the Gold Coast in the 1850s to 70s. And he recorded this kind of amazing proverb book, 3,000, I think it was 3,300 commonly spoken proverbs from the 1850s to 1870s. And he marks out which ones he heard in the 1850s versus the 1870s. So it's a super useful source to think about the kind of common sense wisdom people used to impart more than 150 years ago. And this is really where I found a lot of my sources around prisons because, it was a until my work, it was kind of universally held in African history that Africans did not have prisons before colonial rule, and that it's European states that import the prison to Africa. You know, and I mean, the logic was, why would Africans have prisons when they have such low population density? If you're going to punish someone, you could exile them or execute them. It just doesn't make any financial sense in a country of low population density to have a prison system. So prisons are a European idea, a European ideological artifact that is imported into Africa. And while I believed that was not the case because of the prisons I was looking at, documentarily, it is pretty hard to trace the emergence of the prison system because they're not created by the colonial state. They're created by merchants and African people who are not literate at this time and therefore would not archive their own creations? How do you trace the history or the origins of something when it's perpetuated by people who don't write? And so Proverbs ended up being very important to me. Looking at this proverb book from the 1850s before colonial rule and having all these proverbs about prisons certainly helped prove that prisons existed before colonial rule. Um, some of the proverbs were and some were really helpful. Like one was like, "No one puts a child in prison," and even though that sounds kind of hilarious, it's like I'd never seen any evidence that children had ever been in prison. And that was actually really important because in before the 19th century, during the period of Atlantic trade, we know that children were very, very common hostages for debt. Pawns tended to be women and children. I mean, they used to be held as collateral for loans, but something about the institutionalization of hostage holding through the debtor's prison saw children removed from that world and had that world concentrated around women. I'd noticed that. I didn't necessarily have anything to say about it, but when I came across this proverb saying nobody puts a child in prison, you're like, oh, right, because for whatever reason, these were now child-free spaces. Another one was like, how was it? It was like, no matter how beautiful a prison is, you don't like living there. And I thought that was interesting because, I mean, of course, these prisons were really horrible dungeons. But it spoke to this idea that that they are intended to be, and that human captivity was not unlike in the European context where people thought about these penitentiaries really as like spaces of reform in theory. Like in theory, there's supposed to be these rehabilitative spaces that build a man anew, that turns an unruly criminal into a law-abiding citizen. They were supposed to be these modernizing spaces. I mean, Africans had none of those pretenses. They're like, no, that's supposed to be a horrible space. That's the point of prison. Prison's supposed to be horrible. And it spoke to a very different kind of penal logic. So those proverbs ended up being just like really enormously important clues for me in trying to understand a system, a carceral system that was really based on African ideas about kinship, about punishment, about criminal responsibility, about finance, just a totally different carceral world than the one we were familiar with.
Yeah, no, very much so. And it's sort of like no matter how nice the place is, you're still socially ostracized. So the real prison is not being near people. It doesn't matter your surroundings. The real surroundings to be with are people or something like this. And there does seem to be a weird moment in which there are children in prison. And that's when women recently gave birth and the kid still needs like milk or some sort of sustenance from the mother figure. Um, there's, like, these weird moments, where they're given such sense of revered humanity despite being considered human collateral. Would you mind talking about some of those moments? And also, there's this terrifying moment in the piece, or maybe not terrifying so much as it's supposed to be humiliating in various ways, where they use, menstruation blood on the man. Would you mind talking about those 2 things?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the points that I make in the concept of the prison of the womb is that it's not just a prison of the womb because reproduction is being held hostage, but if you have a carceral system that is based around the captivity of a woman's body and not a man's, it is structured in a different way. I mean, it's structured to really think about the woman's body, and that includes menstruation, and includes pregnancy, includes childbirth. So the most common prisoner in the prison of the womb was as a pregnant woman. And I argue that's because, I mean, it literally metaphorically holds reproduction hostage. I mean, that woman is going to have a child. And of course, having a child born inside the unsanitary context of the prison puts the life of the mother and the child at risk. That's a very real risk. But also, I mean, menstrual blood was considered kind of spiritually toxic and very potent force. I mean, women who were menstruating were not supposed to be intermingling in public. And so you couldn't have a menstruating woman inside the prison. It kind of made the whole space, the space of the house toxic. And so a pregnant woman, her menstruation was suspended. So she couldn't menstruate. So this was the ideal prisoner. Um, and so inside the prison, inside the context of the prison, I mean, menstrual blood took on this very kind of punitive form. And I have this example from the kingdom of Achimabiyakwa, where these political dissidents who belonged to Asamaikese, it was a a community that was attempting to secede from Achimabiyakwa for various reasons. And the Omahine has these guys punished by having sanitary pads full of menstrual bloods, like gagged over their mouths. A real statement about how exactly the carceral space was gendered as female, gendered as a place of female punishment, of female bodily behaviors and actions. And it seems like a lot of women may have given birth during prison because the most common prisoner was a pregnant woman. And so there were oftentimes very small children who were either incarcerated with their mothers because they hadn't weaned yet or had just been born. So this was really this space, this carceral space that kind of mediated this liminal space of birthing, sexuality, reproduction, lactating. I mean, that was the space the prison was designed to hold.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I think we came up to our time, and you answered all of the questions more like amazingly, as always. Is there anything else you want to say
Um,
before we go?
no, I mean, this has been really great. And I'm currently working on a book called Collateral, which is about this long kind of 500-year history through which women's bodies were held as ransom in order to kind of mediate slave trading, finance, and everyday law and order in West Africa. So this chapter on the prison of the womb is going to be a chapter in this book, but the book itself will think about this 500-year history of women collateral as being the backbone of economics, finance, and governance in West Africa.
It's amazing. I'm sure it'll be essential reading as soon as it comes out. So thank you so much for spending time. It's one,
Yeah, thanks so much, Lee, for having me on again.
of course. I'll see you soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.